Welcome, my amazing friends. Today, I will tell you a story that changed the world. A story of ships and swords, of kings and colonies, of pride and pain. You've heard of London. You've seen the British flag. You know the English language. But what if I told you that behind the beauty of London, behind the English your children speak today, there is a dark shadow? A powerful empire that once ruled over 25% of Earth. This is not just a history lesson. This is a true story. A story full of war, hunger, slavery, rebellion, and resistance. For 400 years, the British Empire controlled countries across Asia, Africa, America, and beyond. And while it gave the world trains, schools, and law, it also brought blood, chains, and silence. This is the story of how a small island called Britain became the most powerful empire in history, and how that power finally fell apart. If you've never heard this before, then sit back, listen closely, and open your heart, because once you hear this story, you will never see the world the same way again. This will improve your English too. You'll learn new words, feel new emotions, and get stronger with every part. Let's begin. Chapter 1. How it all began. A small island with big dreams. In the early 1500s, England was just one small island in Europe. It was not powerful. It was not rich. It had kings, farmers, fishermen, and dreams of glory. Spain and Portugal were already exploring the world. They had colonies in South America, Africa, and Asia. They had ships, they had gold, they had power. And the British? They wanted the same. The first step to power was not soldiers. It was ships. Queen Elizabeth I supported explorers like Francis Drake, a pirate to some, a hero to others. They began sailing around the world, trading, stealing, fighting, and learning. They found new lands, new riches, and new people. And slowly, England's hunger for more began to grow. Why stay small, they thought, when the world is out there, waiting to be taken? The East India Company. In 1600, a group of rich English businessmen created something dangerous: the British East India Company. At first, it was just about trade. They wanted spices from India, tea from China, silk from Asia. But they didn't just trade. They brought guns, they built forts, they hired soldiers, and step by step, they started to control the lands where they traded. By the 1700s, the East India Company was not just a company. It was an army, a government, and an empire in disguise. India was rich in gold, spices, cotton, and culture. But it was also divided. Many kingdoms, many rulers. The British East India Company used this to their advantage. They made deals with local kings. They created internal conflicts. They bribed, betrayed, and took control, one region at a time. In 1757, the Battle of Plassey changed everything. The British defeated the powerful Nawab of Bengal. That was the moment. The British Empire truly began. After Bengal, the company took more. Punjab, Delhi, South India. They forced farmers to grow cash crops instead of food. The result? Famines, starvation, death. Millions died while British merchants grew rich. Indian wealth was shipped to Britain, while Indian people suffered. And all of this was just the beginning. At the same time, the British were taking land in North America, the Caribbean, Africa, Australia. They brought slaves from Africa to work in sugar fields. They called it trade, but it was human trafficking. Men, women, and children were sold like objects, torn from their homes, branded, chained, whipped. The British called it business. History calls it evil. Part 2. Revolutions, Rebellions, and the Rise of British Power. In the 1700s, the British Empire had colonies across the world. One of the most important was 13 colonies in North America, places like Boston, New York, Virginia. These colonies were rich in land, resources, and trade. But the people living there, many of them British settlers, started to feel angry. Why? Because even though they lived in America, they had to pay high taxes to the British king, follow British laws, accept decisions made by a government in London thousands of miles away. They had no real voice, no freedom, no respect. The final spark came in 1773 when the British imposed a heavy tax on tea. A group of angry Americans dressed as native people entered a ship and threw 342 chests of tea into the sea. This was called the Boston Tea Party. Britain was shocked and furious. They sent soldiers. They passed strict laws. They tried to control the colonies harder. But it was too late. In 1775, the American War of Independence began. For 8 years, British soldiers fought American revolutionaries. They believed they could easily win. After all, they were the strongest empire. But the Americans had something powerful: the desire to be free. In 1783, Britain surrendered. The United States of America was born. It was the first major loss for the British Empire. And a lesson: you can rule people with fear, but you can't kill their dream of freedom. While the empire was losing America, it was tightening its grip on India. The British East India Company controlled large parts of India like Bengal, Madras, and Bombay. But they didn't stop there. They used a method called divide and rule. This meant they would turn one Indian kingdom against another, promise support to one ruler, then betray them later. Control by manipulation, not just war. They forced Indian farmers to grow indigo and opium. They made local rulers puppets, and they filled their ships with gold, cotton, silk, tea, and money, while Indians died of hunger. They even forced opium into China, starting the Opium Wars. But we'll explain that in Part 3. By now, the British weren't just traders. They were the unofficial rulers of India. But all of this greed, all of this injustice, it was building something dangerous: rage. And that rage exploded in 1857. This was one of the most important uprisings in British history. It began with Indian soldiers, called sepoys, who worked for the British Army. These soldiers were told to use new rifles. To use them, they had to bite open greased cartridges. But there was a problem. The cartridges were greased with cow and pig fat. For Hindus, cows are sacred. For Muslims, pigs are forbidden. This wasn't just disrespect. It was a deep insult to religion and culture. The sepoys were furious. In May 1857, they revolted in Meerut, killing British officers and marching to Delhi. The fire spread. Thousands of Indians joined. Kings, peasants, workers, women, they all rose up. For over a year, the British were terrified. They called it the Sepoy Mutiny. But in truth, it was India's first war of independence. Innocent people died on both sides. British women and children were killed. Indian civilians were brutally punished. In the end, the rebellion was crushed. But the message was clear. India would not be silent forever. And something huge happened after that. After the 1857 rebellion, the British government realized something. The East India Company was too greedy, too corrupt, and too dangerous. So in 1858, The British Parliament officially took control. Queen Victoria became the Empress of India. Now India was no longer ruled by a company. It was ruled directly by the British Crown. The British called this the Raj, a system where British officers controlled Indian land, law, money, and life. They said they were bringing civilization, but Indians were not allowed in top government jobs, not paid equally, treated like second-class people in their own country. Railways, schools, and roads were built, but mostly to help the British move goods and soldiers. And behind the beautiful buildings was suffering. While all this was happening in India, the British turned their eyes to Africa. Africa was rich in gold, diamonds, land, and labor. But it was divided into tribes and kingdoms. The British, along with the French, Dutch, and others, started the scramble for Africa. They drew fake borders, took land by force, captured local leaders, controlled people through violence and bribery. They used Africans as cheap labor, made them work in mines, farms, and railways. And yes, slavery was still happening even after it was officially banned. In places like Nigeria, Kenya, and South Africa, the British took local languages, banned native religions, taught only English and British values. They tried to erase identity and call it progress. But inside, Africans remembered who they were. The British weren't stopping. They took Australia, calling it Terra Nullius, no one's land. But it wasn't empty. It was home to Aboriginal people. For over 50,000 years, the British sent prisoners to live there. They took land from the natives. They treated them as savages. In the Caribbean, they used African slaves to grow sugar cane. Millions died from overwork, heat, and disease. From Jamaica to Trinidad, the British grew rich, while slaves were beaten, starved, and worked to death. The British called it a civilizing mission. The white man's burden, teaching the world how to live. But what they really brought was exploitation, control, profit for Britain, pain for the people. They built railways, but only to move their goods. They built schools, but only to teach their version of truth. They created laws, but used them to stay in power. By the end of the 1800s, the British Empire was massive. India, Africa, Canada, Australia, Caribbean, parts of the Middle East, islands across the ocean. But underneath this giant system were cracks. People were angry, hurt, awake, and remembering. Part 3. World Wars, Resistance, and the Beginning of the End. As the 20th century began, the British Empire stood at its peak. It controlled a quarter of the planet's land, more than 400 million people. But below the surface, things were changing. People across the empire were starting to question the system, understand their stolen identity, learn new ideas about freedom, justice, and nationhood. Newspapers, books, and education were helping people wake up. But then, the world was thrown into chaos. World War I. In 1914, a single gunshot in Europe changed everything. A prince was assassinated in Sarajevo, and within weeks, the world was at war. Britain, France, Germany, Russia, and Austria-Hungary were all involved. The British Empire needed help, and it turned to its colonies. They called for soldiers from India, Africa, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, the Caribbean. Over 2.5 million men from India joined the war. Hundreds of thousands more came from Africa and the rest of the empire. They were promised respect, better treatment, possibly even self-rule. But what they got was Racism, lower pay, harder conditions. Indian soldiers died in muddy trenches in Europe. African porters carried weapons and supplies through jungles, often with no boots or medical care. They were used, and then forgotten. When the war ended in 1918, the British Empire celebrated victory. But the people of the empire asked a simple question. We fought and died for you. Now will you treat us as equals? The answer was no. And that answer changed everything. In India, after World War I, the British passed new laws to control protest. One law was called the Rowlatt Act. It allowed the British to arrest anyone without trial. On April 13, 1919, in Amritsar, thousands of Indians gathered peacefully in a garden called Jallianwala Bagh. They were unarmed, peacefully protesting, including women and children. But General Reginald Dyer, a British officer, saw them as a threat. Without warning, he ordered his soldiers to open fire. In minutes, over 1,000 people were killed. Many were shot in the back as they tried to escape. There was only one narrow exit, and soldiers blocked it. This was one of the most brutal massacres in British history. The British government praised Dyer. They gave him money. Some called him a hero. But across India, people cried. And one man decided, enough. His name was Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi. Gandhi was different. He didn't believe in guns. He didn't believe in violence. He believed in truth, what he called satyagraha, and in peaceful resistance. He told Indians, don't fight them with weapons. Fight them by refusing to obey. He asked people to stop buying British clothes, stop paying unfair taxes, spin their own cotton, march peacefully, even when beaten. In 1930, Gandhi led the famous Salt March, walking 240 miles to the sea to make salt illegally as a protest against British salt laws. The British arrested him again and again, but each time more people joined. And around the world, people saw something new. A man in simple clothes, fighting the biggest empire in the world, without lifting a single hand. The British were afraid, because now their control was being broken by peace. In Africa, the story was different, but the pain was the same. After World War I, Africans expected change, but the British continued to control land, take resources, punish protesters, crush native traditions. In Kenya, a leader named Jomo Kenyatta began speaking for the rights of Africans. In Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah started organizing students and workers. In Nigeria, Nnamdi Azikiwe demanded education and respect. These leaders studied in British schools, but they saw how Britain spoke about freedom in Europe while denying it in Africa. And slowly, the message spread. If we fought in your wars, if we paid your taxes, if we built your roads, why are we still treated like slaves? The stage was being set. And then, another war came. World War II. In 1939, World War II began. This time, the enemy was Nazi Germany, led by Adolf Hitler. Britain again turned to its empire for help. Once again, millions from the colonies fought in battles, died in war, helped save Britain from collapse. India alone gave over 2.5 million soldiers. But something had changed. This time, people were more aware. This time, they wanted something in return. During the war, Britain promised freedom after peace, to keep the colonies loyal. But after the war ended in 1945, the British were broke, exhausted, and no longer respected. And the colonies knew it. The war changed everything. People across the empire had seen the British struggle, lost family members, heard promises of freedom, waited for decades. But the British didn't want to let go. In India, Quit India movement had already begun. Gandhi had been arrested again. But protests were now happening everywhere. In 1947, Britain finally gave up. India was free. Pakistan was created. And with it came a bloody partition. Over 1 million people died. Millions were forced to migrate. But the empire had lost its crown jewel. The heart of the British Empire was gone. And soon, the rest would follow. After India, one by one, the colonies demanded their freedom. In Ghana, the first sub-Saharan African nation became independent in 1957. In Kenya, the Mau Mau Rebellion, a bloody guerrilla war, forced the British to leave in 1963. In Nigeria, independence came in 1960. In the Caribbean, countries like Jamaica and Trinidad began to break free. In the Middle East, British control over oil-rich lands like Iraq and Palestine collapsed. In Malaysia, in Cyprus, in Zimbabwe, in South Africa, resistance grew louder, stronger, and impossible to ignore. And the British knew. The age of empire was ending. By the 1970s, most of the British colonies were free. The empire was no more. But freedom didn't fix everything. Many former colonies were left. Poor, divided, without stable governments, fighting new internal battles. Borders drawn by the British caused ethnic conflicts. Economies built for British profit collapsed. Languages, cultures, and identities had been erased and had to be rebuilt. And in Britain, they rarely spoke of the empire. They taught the good, not the pain. They celebrated the flag, not the blood behind it. But the world remembered. And that's why this story matters. By the time the last colonies gained their independence, the British flag had come down in most parts of the world. But even though the flags changed, the system did not. The empire had fallen on paper, but it had left deep wounds, wounds that didn't heal quickly. In Africa, Asia, the Caribbean, and the Middle East, countries were free. But they were also poor, divided, underdeveloped, dependent on foreign aid. Why? Because when the British left, they took more than land. They took gold, diamonds, oil, culture, confidence, and centuries of self-rule. What they left behind were broken pieces of nations. One of the biggest problems the British left was artificial borders. They had drawn lines on maps without asking the people living there. In Africa, tribes and ethnic groups were cut in half. For example, the Somali people were split across Somalia, Ethiopia, Djibouti, and Kenya. The Tutsi and Hutu were grouped in Rwanda and Burundi, despite centuries of tension. These artificial borders created conflicts, civil wars, and genocides. In India and Pakistan, the British partition in 1947 led to endless conflict over Kashmir, 3 major wars, a constant nuclear threat even today. In Palestine, the British created a mandate after World War I, made promises to both Jews and Arabs, then left in 1948. And the region has been at war ever since. These are not accidents. They are the results of rushed exits, careless borders, and no accountability. Many former colonies today speak English, and many people consider it an advantage. But the truth is more complex. The English language was used by the British Empire to control education, control law, control opportunity. If you didn't speak English, you couldn't get a government job, go to school, speak in court, write officially. This created a system where local languages were slowly erased. In India, hundreds of languages were ignored. In Africa, Native languages like Shona, Yoruba, and Swahili were called inferior. Children were punished for speaking their mother tongues in school. The language helped global communication, but it also became a tool of shame, class, and separation. One of the ugliest legacies of the British Empire is something you cannot always see, but you can always feel: racism. The empire was built on a belief that white Europeans were superior, that darker-skinned people were less intelligent, that colonized people were not capable of ruling themselves. These beliefs were taught in schools, printed in books, shown in films, preached in churches. In Africa, black people were forced to carry passes, kneel before white officers, and use separate bathrooms. In India, signs said, "Dogs and Indians not allowed." In Australia, the native Aboriginal people were called animals by law until 1967. Even after independence, these ideas remained deep in society. They affected hiring, education, confidence, media, beauty standards, social class. The world still carries these wounds, because ideas are harder to kill than armies. Even after countries became free, they still used British legal systems, school systems, university exams, government styles, dress codes, thinking patterns. This is called cultural colonization, when the empire lives inside your mind. For example, in Nigeria, courts still follow British common law. In India, English literature is still the highest subject of pride. In Kenya, Parliament still looks like the British House of Commons. In the Caribbean, the Queen remained the head of state until recently. Many didn't realize it, but they were still thinking like colonized people. They wore suits in 40-degree heat. They used British words to describe their own culture. They compared themselves to London, and always felt less. This was the invisible empire, an empire that didn't need soldiers. It ruled through memory. The empire may have ended politically, but economically, it continued. After independence, many former colonies exported raw materials like oil, tea, cocoa, and coffee, imported expensive finished goods from Britain and Europe, borrowed money from global banks. This created a cycle. Poor countries remained poor, rich countries remained rich, and the power stayed in the hands of a few. Former colonies were also pushed into Commonwealth trade agreements, deals where Britain still got access to markets, ports, and resources. It looked like cooperation, but often it was control with a smile. Even today, the global financial system is built on structures the British helped design. London is still one of the financial capitals of the world. The pound sterling influences smaller currencies. Former colonies often owe debt to institutions that follow British laws. The pain of empire didn't just affect those who lived through it. It was passed down through stories, silence, fear, and struggle. A Kenyan man whose grandfather was tortured during the Mau Mau Rebellion. A Caribbean woman whose ancestors were slaves on sugar plantations. An Indian boy whose grandmother crossed the border during partition and never spoke about it. A Nigerian girl whose mother was punished in school for speaking Yoruba. These are real scars. They live in family memories, emotions, and identity. Some people grow up ashamed of their culture. Some are angry but don't know why. Some want to heal but don't know where to start. The empire may be gone, but its ghosts still walk among us. Despite all this, the story does not end in sadness. Former colonies are rising. In India, A new generation is reclaiming Indian languages, films, and philosophy. The country has become one of the biggest economies in the world. In Kenya, Swahili is now used in politics, education, and media. Local art, literature, and film are thriving. In Nigeria, Afrobeat music and Nollywood cinema have taken the world by storm. In the Caribbean, nations like Barbados have officially removed the British monarch as head of state. Movements for reparations are growing stronger. In universities and schools around the world, young people are asking, why did we never learn about the empire's crimes? The silence is breaking, and the truth is rising. To understand the modern world, we must understand the empire. Because until we see the roots of injustice, we will never fix the tree. It is not about hate, it is about honesty. It is not about revenge, it is about respect. People in Britain must also know this truth, because most of them were never told what the empire really did. This is not the story of India, not the story of Africa, not the story of the Caribbean. It is the story of all of us. Part 4. Truth, Justice, and the Final Reckoning of the British Empire. By the late 1990s, the British Empire was officially gone. The colonies were free. The Union Jack no longer flew above their palaces. The Queen was no longer their ruler. But now the world was watching. People asked, would Britain apologize? Would they admit what they had done? Would they teach the truth in their schools? Would they repair the damage? The answers were not simple. Inside Britain, something strange happened. The empire was not condemned. It was celebrated. Many British textbooks said, the empire spread democracy, railways, and education. Museums filled with looted objects from India, Africa, and Asia remained silent. The British Museum still displayed the Benin bronzes, the Koh-i-Noor diamond, Egyptian mummies, and stolen artifacts from dozens of countries. There were no signs saying, this was taken by force. This belongs to another nation. This was part of colonial violence. Instead, the empire was remembered like a proud grandfather, not like what it truly was, a system of conquest, exploitation, and control. In the Caribbean, African, and South Asian nations, people began asking, you stole from us for centuries. You made billions while we starved. You left us broken. Now, will you pay us back? This demand was called reparations. It did not mean give us cash. It meant public apology, return of stolen artifacts, financial help to rebuild systems, truth in history books, ending the silence. In Jamaica, politicians demanded reparations for the centuries of slavery. In Kenya, elderly survivors of the Mau Mau Rebellion sued the British government for torture, rape, and imprisonment. In India, leaders asked for the return of the Koh-i-Noor diamond, one of the most valuable gems in the world, taken during colonization. In South Africa, historians demanded Britain acknowledge its role in racial apartheid systems. And in Barbados, the country cut ties with the British monarchy and officially became a republic in 2021. But how did Britain respond? With resistance, denial, and delay. Some leaders said, it's too late now. We did good things too. It's in the past. We owe nothing. But the world didn't stop speaking. When governments refused to speak, the people did. Filmmakers, poets, historians, artists, and educators began telling the story of empire from the other side. Books like Empire Land by Sathnam Sanghera, The Anarchy by William Dalrymple, Legacy of Violence by Caroline Elkins, revealed truths hidden for decades, how millions were killed in colonial famines, how freedom fighters were called terrorists, how cultures were erased, how racism was invented to control minds. Documentaries exposed how slaves were branded, nations were looted, and resistance was crushed. Young people in Britain began asking, why didn't we learn this in school? Why is Churchill called a hero when he caused famine in Bengal? Why are we proud of empire but ashamed of the truth? University students campaigned to remove statues of slave traders, rename buildings, create courses on colonial history, and push for a new understanding of what Britain really was. The empire was not being taught from the top down. It was being uncovered from the ground up. Even in today's world, the shadow of empire remains. In immigration laws, former colonies often face stricter rules. Refugees from war-torn countries, once ruled by Britain, are rejected by the country that once ruled them. In global economics, former colonies still depend on Western aid and trade. Their industries were destroyed long ago and never allowed to rebuild. In language and culture, many countries still measure success in English fluency, British education, Western appearance. In human emotion, many still carry shame of their language, skin, identity, or history, while many in Britain still carry pride for an empire they were never told the truth about. This is the invisible empire. It no longer controls land, but it still controls thinking. But now, a new generation is saying enough. Young people across the world are studying history, speaking openly, reclaiming their languages, reviving their art, telling their stories, asking hard questions, and demanding truth, justice, and healing. In Nigeria, Afrobeat musicians speak about colonial trauma in their lyrics. In India, Dalit writers are sharing how British laws deepened caste divisions. In Trinidad, writers are retelling the sugarcane era through poetry. In Kenya, children are learning Swahili with pride. In London, students are protesting statues of slave owners. They are not asking for pity. They are asking for truth. They are not blaming today's generation. They are blaming the systems that were never changed. The empire may be over, but the lesson is not finished. If Britain wants to truly move forward, it must teach the full truth about its past, acknowledge the pain it caused, return what was stolen, repair what was broken. Stop hiding behind silence, because healing only begins with honesty. This is not just Britain's story. This is your story, if you speak English. This is your story, if your country was ruled. This is your story, if you live in a world shaped by power, race, and history. And if we don't tell this story completely, it will repeat in another form. There was a time when they said, the sun never sets on the British Empire. But every empire falls. The Mongols fell, Rome fell, and Britain fell. Not with fire from outside, but with truth from within. What remains today is not pride. What remains is responsibility. The responsibility to remember those who died, honor those who resisted, tell the story fully, and never allow any nation to rule another with lies again. This was not just the history of an empire. This was the story of real people, of pain that was hidden, of courage that was silenced, of voices that were never heard. Now the truth is out. The world cannot heal without remembering, and we cannot move forward by forgetting. So let's carry this story, not with hate, but with honesty, with hope, and with the promise, never again. If this story opened your eyes, if it made you feel something, then let's keep learning together. Subscribe to this channel, not just for English, but to understand the world, to question the past, and to build a better future. Because knowledge is power, and stories like this deserve to be heard. I'll see you in the next video.